Dark Souls 2 must be one of the most interesting games of all time. Some passionately hate it and think it's one of the worst games ever made, whereas others think it's one of the greatest games they've ever played. Some think vanilla Dark Souls 2 is pretty good and that Scholar ruined it, while others love both versions with a slight preference towards one or the other, and a third group hate both versions, saying that one is worse than the other, but both are downright terrible. I actually managed to get more hate for my Dark Souls 2 critique than my Elden Ring critique, despite Dark Souls 2 being commonly referred to as the worst in the series. So what's going on here? The differing opinions in Dark Souls 2 are so divided that it almost makes it seem like we are all playing a different game. And that's because, well, we are. As I stated in my previous video, not every Souls game is perfectly balanced to give the hard but fair difficulty for every playstyle, and your playstyle in Dark Souls 2 impacts the quality of your experience more than any other Souls game ever made. When I first pondered the idea of creating another Dark Souls 2 video, I was horrified. Why make another Dark Souls 2 video? That would require me playing more Dark Souls 2 in different ways to see if my opinion changes. That sounds like a nightmare, but I had to do it because I had to understand the other side. These Dark Souls 2 fans are so passionate about how it's the most replayable game ever, so I had to see this through. Welcome to my very own In Defense of Dark Souls 2 video, where we ask but one simple question: did I play the game wrong in my initial critique? This thought occurred to me as a very vocal group of people who enjoy Dark Souls 2, some of which claiming it to be the best Souls game ever, presented arguments to counterpoints raised in my critique. They crafted two main arguments in the comments section as to why Dark Souls 2 is not a bad game as stated in my critique, and in this video we will cover each of the two arguments in defense of Dark Souls 2. The first, much larger section of this video titled In Defense of Dark Souls 2 will address the more reasonable of the two arguments, which is that I hate Dark Souls 2 because I didn't play it like an RPG. On an unrelated note, many commenters were disappointed that I did not find Santa's workshop in the North Pole, so we will end this part of the video with a treat: Santa's Demon Reindeer Land gone wrong, gone. The second tiny end section of this video, in defense of my hate-filled critique about Dark Souls 2, will cover the argument that my critique was a biased hit piece against Dark Souls 2 in which I set up the worst gank squads intentionally by triggering enemy aggro to make the game look bad. I'll say it right now that this argument isn't very good, but for some strange reason it was the most upvoted and popular counter-argument against my critique in the comments, despite not being nearly as good as the first argument. Either way, this video works both as a sequel to my Dark Souls 2 critique, as well as its own standalone essay. If you don't like Dark Souls 2 and want to see someone throw more hate at the game, then you will enjoy my Dark Souls 2 critique. If that doesn't interest you and you just want to see my defense for Dark Souls 2, then you're in the right place. This is also the part of the video where I do the YouTube things and ask for likes and subs and plug my Patreon. But who am I kidding? It doesn't matter either way. I'm talking about Dark Souls 2 again, which means I'll get another wave of mean comments and dislikes because Dark Souls 2 is scientifically the greatest masterpiece of all time. But who cares about people hating on them anyway? It's time for the #1 Dark Souls 2 hater Feeble to craft his very own In Defense of Dark Souls 2 video. Yes, I know, we're all shocked. What does it mean to play a game wrong? If you say that to a Dark Souls player, then you'll get accused of being a dumb elitist. So let's rephrase the question. Is there a playstyle that is ideal for getting the maximum enjoyment out of a Souls game? Well, that's a dumb question too, because it's different for everyone. Every different person will have their own preferred playstyle, so just do what you think is the most fun and don't worry too much about it. I used to believe that this was true, until I played Dark Souls 2. The question we should be asking here isn't, is there a playstyle that is ideal for getting the maximum enjoyment out of a Souls game, but rather, is there a playstyle that is so unfun, playing this way is only meant to cause physical pain to the player? The answer is no, every playstyle is great. Or at least that's true in Dark Souls 1 and 3, because Dark Souls 2 is a whole different beast. For my critique, I played through Dark Souls 2 with the broadsword and no magic, no spells, no ranged attacks of any kind to speak of, no summons, no shields. I think you get the picture. I'm a big dodge R1 purist in these games because I enjoy doing that. When people first said that I didn't enjoy Dark Souls 2 because I didn't treat it like an RPG, I was genuinely confused. What do you mean I need to experiment with my build when I beat Dark Souls 2 level 1 fun with a broadsword, no magic. What do you mean I need to experiment with my build when I first timed almost every single boss in the base game, including all 3 phases of the final boss, and the Rotten, and the Pursuer, and the Chariot, and the Duke's Deer Freya, and the Poison Snake Lady, and the Old Iron King, and the Twin Dragon Riders, and the list goes on. But I died like 20 times the Covetous Demon, the hardest boss in the game. Any boss I didn't beat first try, I did beat in 3 attempts or less, meaning the only bosses that provided any challenge and could kill me about 10-ish times were Sur Alone and Sin, and that's it. So if my build can beat what is widely considered the hardest Dark Souls 2 boss, Fume Knight, in 4 tries, then it's probably a good build. Many people are already sick of me gloating about how easy the bosses were and how I curb stomped them all and just want to get to the point already, so I will. No matter how much you love Dark Souls 2, you must admit there is a serious balancing issue between the boss and level difficulty. The bosses are already a cakewalk with the beginning weapon, but oh boy is the level design hard as balls. This odd imbalance in difficulty is why I stated in my critique that the world of Dark Souls 2 feels like a series of hard boss runs with the easiest bosses in the series meant to torment me with artificial difficulty. The bosses are too easy. Well, that's not always true. It'll sure be hard if the player forgets Blue Smelter Demon's moveset after a single death because it takes 15 minutes of suffering just for one more measly attempt. Ignoring the weird difference in difficulty between enemies and bosses, my issues with the levels were in part my own fault as my monkey brain never wanted to switch from the starting weapon. A purist like me will always assume that the starting sword is best sword. Unfortunately for me, this idea didn't seem to hold up since I would miss many of my hits with this weapon as a result of dumb, undertuned player hitboxes. It was also quite difficult to hit multiple enemies at the same time with the starting broadsword, as I needed to use the slower heavy attack to achieve this, something that severely hurt my enjoyment of the game, since it's all centered around gank squads. But what if there was another way? What if there was a fun way to play Dark Souls 2? As I mentioned in my critique, I really dislike using ranged attacks in these games because they slow down the pace of play and I don't find it mechanically interesting. So using arrows will not increase my enjoyment of Dark Souls 2, but many people in the comments recommended a build that I never considered as the optimal way to play Dark Souls 2. So let's see if an ultra great sword power stancing build can make Dark Souls 2 great again. It's always hard for me to talk about Dark Souls 2. If you went back in time to ask Young Feeble, would you like to play an old school RPG with minimal story elements, lackluster graphics, and the only way you're supposed to overcome challenges by bringing a good build, I'd proudly say, no, that sounds kinda boring. Of course, this isn't a fair analysis on my part, because I can't just say that Dark Souls 2 with power stancing is Kingsfield hit trading combat and nothing else, because it's not true. But I can say that the Souls-like mechanics of the dodge roll don't work as a result of all the terrible hitboxes. At least not all of the time. Against certain enemies, the dodge roll might as well be a Persona 5% chance to dodge rather than a skill check that guarantees your safety. I consider most of Dark Souls 2 with a weak build to be an advanced form of torture meant to suck all the joy out of life. You may disagree and say that dodging almost always works in Dark Souls 2, which is true. If you're skilled enough, the Persona % chance to dodge an attack can be above 95% success rate. But in a game where you dodge every 2 seconds and one mistimed dodge can be the difference between life and death because damage is so high, then the tiny percent of dodges that don't work due to agility or bad hitboxes really piss me off. It angers me so much, and the hitboxes weren't even fixed in the definitive Scholar of the First Sin edition. And you know why? Because the lackluster combat mechanics don't matter when you're playing the game like an RPG. This brings us to power stancing. This playstyle offers a fun dual-wielding combat system where you use all 4 controller bumpers and triggers to mix and match your combos, taking the first step in the Dark Souls series of making the player character have a more involved moveset rather than just R1 spam. The beginning areas of the game all get much more tolerable when played this way. A good example would be No Man's Wharf. I always thought this area stood out as the first Dark Souls 2 level that went too far and was terrible, but when I two-shot all the enemies with sweeping giant sword attacks, great sword attacks, it's not all that bad. Are the hidden gank squads nonsensical and so well hidden that I still don't know where the enemies are coming from? Yes. But am I overpowered enough to just kill all the enemies with ease? Also, yes. If I were to sum up the Dark Souls 2 power stancing experience into just 3 words, I would say Skyrim, but hard. Now, I know I just pissed off a few people by saying Dark Souls 2 is Skyrim combat, but then again, so did Dark Souls 1 if you had the right poise build and high enough damage. The new power stancing feeble will go up to a group of enemies, trade blows, dodge roll out, and use my infinite healing to regain health, and then I trade more blows. Infinite heals seems to reinforce this as the intended playstyle since I can trade infinitely, something not true in other Souls titles. Someone's gonna say it's not infinite because there's a limit. No, there's no limit. If you hit the limit, if you use 99 life gems, it's infinite. I can now kill the enemies fast enough to make clearing the levels less time consuming than running past all the enemies to die sometimes while opening a door, whereas clearing the gank squads in a weak build was unbearably slow and dull. The issue with overpowered hit trading is that the game no longer functions as an action game. In order for something to be an action game, by my definition, it would have to be like Dark Souls 3 or Devil May Cry 3, where there is enough of a skill gap so that a good player will know that every source of incoming damage received is their own fault. While you can beat Dark Souls 2 as an action game first with a weak build, it's not good. Refer to my hate-filled critique about Dark Souls 2 as evidence. Is Dark Souls 2 a terrible game when hit trading with overpowered weapons? No, I cannot say that, but do you still need to do a lot of BS boss runs to fight easy bosses? Why yes, you do. Power stancing and summoning may make the levels more enjoyable to clear, but it doesn't fix the Dark Souls 2 problem, which is, at least for me, bland and very easy boss fights surrounded by the worst boss runs in the series. It doesn't matter now that I'm overpowered, I still don't enjoy doing the long boss run, and I still don't enjoy the vast majority of Dark Souls 2 bosses. A minority of people will enjoy the old, brutal, dungeon-clearing game feel, where the boss isn't the highlight of the level and just a mini end challenge to see if you're worthy to progress. Think of an old arcade game where the boss is hard because dying means restarting at the beginning and having to put in another quarter, but if you took out the level leading up to the boss, then you'd probably beat him in 2 or 3 tries. I prefer mechanically hard bosses with easier boss runs, but the Dark Souls 2 team couldn't make a single hard boss in the base game, unless you count Ancient Dragon, who is more of a robot than a boss. Velstad's cool, but I still beat him 3rd try, so I couldn't say it was a challenge. Maybe Dark Lurker. I never fought him, and I probably won't, because I'm just not going to do the work to fight him, but I've heard good things. So power stancing improves the beginning areas and makes the easy bosses even easier. But what about those hard endgame levels? Has my opinion changed on these areas? Similar to Skyrim, the recommended build for victory is to be a jack of all trades with decent HP, melee weapons, spells, and arrows all at once to overcome the challenge. Unlike Skyrim, where you can just sort of stat for one build and be fine because there's an adjustable difficulty slider, Dark Souls 2 requires you to use all of your strongest jack of all trades, melee, and range tools in combat, maybe even with summons, to be victorious without wanting to pull your hair out in frustration. This is because Dark Souls 2 endgame is unfair to anyone who isn't a multi-classing monster. I was surprised how terrible Iron Keep still was while power stancing, because high melee damage that let me hit trade did not counter hidden archers. I need arrows, and I probably should look up where a good bow is to upgrade, and I should probably look up where to get the upgrade materials, and also where to find the best rings, and the best spells, and maybe a shield, and blah blah blah. I don't care, and I'm not going to do it. And you want to know why I'm not going to do it? It's because I play Souls games for fun, action, not for min-maxing the best build. Hell, I haven't even beaten Dark Souls 1 or 3 without being level 1 at all in the past year. And this brings it all right back to Elden Ring, the only thing I talk about in this channel. There's a connection between Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring that I wouldn't have noticed without the comment section. Both of these games are RPGs over action combat games. Now, this is a controversial statement to make, as every Dark Souls game is both a stat-based RPG and an action game. But which playstyle is intended by the developers as your go-to when you can't overcome a challenge? In my previous video, the #1 problem with Dark Souls and Elden Ring, I explained that Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne are very hard to beat as an RPG. This is due to how some bosses like Midir counter so many builds, forcing players out of shield use with the options to either throw down a million pestilent mist spells or to just learn the dodge roll patterns and attack with a melee build. A boss like Midir that severely punishes any non-dodge based playstyle makes the game feel more like an action game than an RPG, and I love action action games, and I love Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, and from what I've heard, Sekiro are all action games first. Dark Souls 1 is split in the middle, as I play the game as an action game and always have had a good time, at least until the last few areas. But Dark Souls 1 does not punish those who want to win through build variety over learning openings and dodge roll patterns, as you can just make a strength build with insane poise. However, Dark Souls 2 level design and Elden Ring boss design lean much more heavily into the RPG side of things, rather than making the experience fun for those who want to interact with the action combat mechanics. Some people are already disagreeing with my take on Elden Ring bosses, and while I've made much more in-depth videos on my thoughts on Elden Ring boss design, a very quick summary is that the bosses have way too few openings and too many insane combos for the intended fun experience to be waiting for an opening for 10 minutes. So the way most people end up playing is either with a high poise break weapon or bleed proc, or both, that will allow you to hit trade with bosses. And if you are hit trading, then the stats of your weapon and HP matter more than the skill of learning the boss patterns and openings. Therefore, Elden Ring boss design is crafted for those who want something that is mechanically similar to a turn-based RPG, just in real time to represent it, as you trade damage in both games until the person who is luckier with boss AI or has the higher numbered stats wins. Basically Skyrim combat, but harder because you can't heal in the pause menu. You have to disengage from combat to heal, which is much more difficult. Dark Souls 2 is somewhat like this. The level design of Dark Souls 2 is so ridiculous that anyone watching my video probably wondered why I would do something like beat the whole game with the broadsword, as it seems so obviously unfun. But in Dark Souls 1 or 3, I would have a ton of fun with this playstyle, because just about every encounter with normal enemies in those games is so well designed around being hard but fair to overcome with a normal weapon, and summons or OP weapons are optional ways of adjusting the difficulty. Dark Souls 2 is designed to be as unfair as possible to weaker builds, meaning that the game plays much more like an RPG, where your build choice and maybe even summons are meant to be how the player overcomes difficulty, with a no summon broadsword only run as an unfun experience that only masochists like myself would ever do. If I were to say that Elden Ring bosses are completely irredeemably awful because they were unfun on a weak no summons melee build, that would make me a bad critic, as I'm completely ignoring the alternative playstyles of hit trading with overpowered weapons and summons. Of course, I don't enjoy beating the bosses this way, but I need to at least mention that the boss design isn't unfair for every playstyle just because I decide to use a weak melee build. Similarly, it was unfair of me to not give the same level of respect to Dark Souls 2. So if I play through Dark Souls 2 levels or Elden Ring bosses as an RPG, I will start to have fun, right? Well, no, not really. In order to understand why I wasn't having fun with Dark Souls 2 even while power stancing, I had to completely rethink why I like video games in the first place. If nothing else, discussing the quality of Dark Souls 2 will always be thought-provoking. Dark Souls 2 managed to reveal something about myself that not even I knew. I don't like role-playing games. Now, this is a weird statement to make, as I absolutely adore RPGs. They are some of my favorite games of all time, from Dark Souls to The Witcher to Persona 5 to all my different Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. Many of my greatest gaming experiences are in RPGs. But why do I love RPGs? I think the main reason is the story, characters, and just the chance to explore a cool fantasy world. I play role-playing games more for the roleplay and less for the increasing my stats. Although the Skinner box game of getting loot and levels can be a fun distraction while I experience the story and the world. But do I really love the game mechanics of RPGs? If I were to strip out all of the story and world, would I still love the genre? The answer is quite frankly no, I wouldn't love the genre at all. Dungeons & Dragons is great because of all the stories it creates, not because I like how mechanically engaging it is to roll a die. I interact with the pen and paper number side of an RPG in spite of not wanting to read or what build or weapon to use, not because I enjoy it. There are some exceptions like Diablo 2 or Path of Exile where the character building process and skill tree is so good that I don't care and I love the game anyways, as the goal of creating your ideal hero is king in these games. But if you're going to claim that creating a Dark Souls build is as engaging as creating a Diablo 2 build, then I'm going to have to hard disagree. So what if there was a challenging RPG with a world I didn't find interesting, combined with a half-baked action combat system where dodging doesn't always work, and there's extreme punishment for death, and you have to read a lot online or just try a bunch of different builds to find something overpowered enough to combat the jank in extremely difficult levels? Well, that sounds completely awful and I would never play it, but that's basically Dark Souls 2. You might hate that I'm saying this because Dark Souls 2 is beatable with skill and you can win every encounter at level 1 with the starting weapon, and I did. But where Dark Souls 1 and 3 are built around being mechanically fun even at level 1, Dark Souls 2 isn't. And that's not just because of agility, you can get that pretty high at level 1, it's because the levels encourage clearing every enemy while throwing giant hordes of enemies at the player, which is agonizing unless you have a great build. Some people might disagree with me saying that I didn't like the world of Dark Souls 2, and they might say that Drang Lake is magical and is one of their favorite worlds. And on some level, I actually get it. There is a unique melancholy charm of the wacky world of Drang Lake, and in its disconnected nature, every level feels like it was connected through interdimensional portals leading you to a scary pirate town or a lost castle. On the surface, there is a lot to love about the mysterious yet sad and eerie feel of Dark Souls 2, but the average area you find yourself exploring just isn't visually engaging, which is a huge issue for me. There's a serious lack of polish in the textures. Almost every room is completely empty and devoid of any breakable objects like in Dark Souls 1 or 3, and the environmental textures just aren't that appealing when viewed up close. So I dislike the look and feel of Dark Souls 2's world the majority of the time in most interior zones, and I dislike hit trading combat with an OP build and near infinite healing. So what else is there to enjoy in an RPG? Well, there's a story, and we can debate whether or not Dark Souls 2's plot holds up when compared to the first game, which in my opinion it does not, but either way it doesn't really matter because there's so little story in any of these games to speak of. Even if you are literally VOD video watching this right now, you'd be lying if you said the majority of your playtime on your first few characters is spent interacting with the story, because it's impossible. The majority of your Dark Souls experience will be spent killing enemies, clearing levels, and killing bosses, even if you talk to every single NPC. If you love the story of Dark Souls 2, that's great, but unlike Persona 5, where I can tell someone who doesn't love turn-based combat to still play it because the story is that amazing, you just can't make the same argument for any Souls game. So much of Persona is spent talking and moving the plot forward, whereas almost all of Dark Souls is spent murdering enemies with a little plot to wrap up the whole experience. My main point is that I play RPGs for the story and characters first, the world second, and combat like fifth. So if I play Dark Souls like an RPG, I'm just really bored, scavenging my inventory and comparing all my loot while fully exploring every environment to find the best gear, or more realistically, just looking up where the strongest items are to get the best numbers, is boring. I play Dark Souls because I don't need to grind if I can get good, not to become so overpowered through my stats that it would take a literal army of gank squads to kill me. Some people like the feeling of getting OP and using their RPG stats to fight an army of enemies at once, but it just doesn't appeal to me. I love Dark Souls because every second I play on a weak build, the intense fear of death is exhilarating. But if you play Dark Souls 2 on a weak build, you're just wondering why you're being invaded at max hollowing while archers shoot you from a distance and 5 melee enemies gank you from behind. It's so weird that Dark Souls 2 haters think the bosses are bland and the levels are terrible, whereas Dark Souls 2 lovers think the bosses are bland and they play because they love clearing the levels. They love being discouraged to run past enemies because it gives them an excuse to play around with their overpowered power stancing weapons and abilities. Clearing levels on a weak build in Dark Souls 2 is one of the greatest horrors ever known to man, while it is the greatest joy Dark Souls 2 can provide on a strong build, a complete reversal. Besides, who cares that there are no iframes and backstabs or fog walls or levels or anything? Who cares that stamina drains a second after I start and stop running? Who cares that the enemy hitboxes are wrong and hit me in unfair ways? Who cares that the projectiles are actually homing missiles to ensure hidden archers will kill you? Who cares about being ganked 10 times in a row from freaking nowhere? Who cares about the numerous ways Dark Souls 2 is designed to kill you? When I'm this strong, I need the game to be unfair to challenge me. On second thought, this is basically late game Elden Ring bosses. Dark Souls 2 is meant to be unfair because you're supposed to meet the challenge. The reason why New Game Plus adds new enemies, and the reason why it's the only Souls game with a hard mode, is because the game is trying to challenge the most overpowered of multi-classing builds. This game was built in a way that is ideologically opposed to Dark Souls 1, a game based around every gank squad and source of damage being avoidable so that the weakest of builds can overcome the challenge without getting hit. I will always choose my beloved action games of Dark Souls 1 and 3 over the RPG with action elements of Dark Souls 2, but I can now understand why people who have an extremely different preferences for what they enjoy in video games might like or even love Dark Souls 2. At the end of my critique, I stated that the developers of Dark Souls 2 did not enjoy Dark Souls, and they couldn't understand why people loved the first game, so they guessed it was just because it was hard and people died a lot. I now realize that this statement is not only true, but it's actually incomplete. It isn't about whether or not the Dark Souls 2 developers liked the first game, rather that they wanted to create Kingsfield 5, but had to throw a Dark Souls coat of paint over it since Dark Souls sells copies. Think of it like this: a game set in a dark, dreary world with diverse biomes mysteriously scattered about and many hidden, sometimes unfair traps and enemy ambushes that result in your death a lot of the time. That is, unless you min-max and equip your hero with the best gear available to overcome the intense challenge. Now, am I talking about Kingsfield or Dark Souls 2? You may say this holds true for all other Souls titles, but it really doesn't. Dark Souls 1 lands in the hard but fair category on a weak build, while Dark Souls 2 lands in the tear your hair out while screaming on a weak build, which you guys saw me do in my critique. It is possible that the Dark Souls 2 developers really did like the first game. Of course, it doesn't matter because they didn't want to make a good action game and a good RPG game. They just wanted to make a really hard RPG with action on the side. After reading an insightful comment, I realized that Dark Souls 2 was probably created by many previous Kingsfield developers. This newfound information made everything click into place. In other words, this commenter helped solve the riddle of why some love while others hate Dark Souls 2. I finally realized that this whole debate sparked by Joseph Anderson and H. Bomber Guy about why locked off combat is good was all wrong. I now do sincerely believe that locked off combat making gank fights mechanically enjoyable was an accident, and the intended way the developers played their own game was with power stancing and or magic, or maybe a bit of everything. Essentially, the developers played Dark Souls 2 like it was Kingsfield 5, and I overcame the difficulty of this new RPG approach by playing the game as an unlocked action game when this was never the intended design decision. You're taught to use lock-on because, well, you're supposed to use lock-on. The way you overcome adversity isn't supposed to be through skill. You're supposed to become an OP hero with power stancing, ultra great swords, and magic. It doesn't matter if you're locked on or locked off, the developers don't care. All that matters is if you're OP enough to counter the extremely difficult level design. When it comes to what I like in a video game, does a dark dungeon RPG with minimal story beats and overly difficult combat that you must counteract with OP builds sound like a good time to me? Hell no. But would people who love getting OP through stats and trying out new builds to overcome adversity enjoy an RPG game like Kingsfield? Yeah, I bet they would. I probably would hate Kingsfield, whereas a Dark Souls 2 fan would be much more likely to enjoy an experience like that, as Dark Souls 2 is really the evolution of Kingsfield. If we changed a few things around the theme and the story, Dark Souls 2 easily could have been Kingsfield 5. Many hard encounters that are completely unfair unless you start being unfair to counter the difficulty in an RPG stat kind of way. Of course, if you don't want to interact with the RPG side of Dark Souls 2, you can can counter all of the difficulty through skill, and this is exactly what I did in my initial critique. The reason why I titled my critique Another Hate-Filled Critique About Dark Souls 2, but I really tried to like it, was because I made a genuine attempt to enjoy Dark Souls 2's group enemy combat mechanics when locked off. And I did like the game more than my first locked on run, of course. However, there were still so many other issues present, including an obnoxious amount of gank squads, an obnoxious amount of hidden archers, and so many bland boss fights, which all left me still hating the game even more than on my first run. Executing mechanical mastery over group enemy combat and bosses with a weak build left me hating the game more than my first playthrough, not less, despite loving Dark Souls 1 and 3 more at level 1 or on a weak build than if I were to play it on a strong build. There are many things to like about Dark Souls 2, but I barely found any of them since they are all locked behind good builds. This is why the only real positive in my first critique was based in the mechanics of combat, as I treat the Dark Souls series as action games first, RPGs second. Because of my mindset, my main positive presented in the critique for Dark Souls 2 was that locked off combat made the earlier gank fights more mechanically enjoyable. The only issue came later in the critique when I was able to first time almost every boss easily because I used the locked off circle strafe tactic that I learned from the gank fights where I had to be locked off to trivialize almost every single boss with ease. If you really want to maximize mechanical mastery in every boss, you will do locked off circle strafing to avoid most of the boss's attacks without having to roll, trivializing a lot of the challenge. That's probably why Dark Souls 2 makes you run half speed while locked on, combined with having the most punishing stamina drain in the series when you start or stop your run, because they know full speed locked on circle strafing was a mechanical exploit to beat almost all of their bosses, and they wanted to punish players like me who were smart enough to play in the most optimal way possible. What I'm saying should come as no surprise to anyone, because we all know that Dark Souls 2 bosses aren't mechanically interesting, and they sure aren't the main source for my intense hatred against this game. My hatred is all a result of the enemy placement and the level design. A big part of my critique was complaining about the unfair deaths in the levels. Although the belief that Dark Souls 2 has the most cheap deaths in the series is held to be true by the majority of the player base, there are some who disagree. One such individual who disagrees with me is actually my favorite YouTuber, Joseph Anderson. He produced the hottest, most controversial take of them all in his Dark Souls 2 critique when he said Dark Souls 2 did not have drastically more cheap deaths than Dark Souls 1. I know, that's the spiciest opinion yet in YouTube video essay history. It didn't even come from H-Bomber Guy, who knew? But whether or not this statement rings true for you really depends on your definition of a cheap death. Dark Souls 1 can be cheap, but almost every time you die in an unfair way, it kind of feels like an event. A good example of this is the Bridge Dragon. We can argue this isn't a cheap death because the black tar indicates a fire trap could occur, but knowing exactly where to activate it and to run back to avoid damage is a bit too much to expect from a player who is on a blind playthrough, meaning almost all new players will probably die here unless someone warns them about the event. Dark Souls 2 actually has a lot less of these deaths that almost feel like scripted events. The real reason why Dark Souls 2 feels more cheap despite having less event-type deaths is because many of the gank squads and archers are just too well hidden, almost like they really don't want you to find them. Dark Souls 1 hid its gank squads in a way where a new player exploring with patience can reliably scan the area and see a hollow hanging off the edge or an enemy on the ceiling, that is unless you die through a wall to a ghost in New Londo. Now the issue with Dark Souls 2 is that I'm replaying the game on New Game Plus and I still can't figure out where these enemies are coming from. I'll admit it, the gank squads and ranged enemies are so well hidden that sometimes I can't even find them after dying to the enemy and knowing they exist. When Dark Souls 1 kills the player in a somewhat cheap way, it's with so much style that it almost feels intended, like the Bridge Dragon or even the scripted Calamite death. But Dark Souls 2's cheap deaths aren't events, they're just really well hidden gank squads and archers. In other words, cheap deaths in Dark Souls 1 are an epic, if sometimes frustrating, sight to behold, while in Dark Souls 2 it's a feature. My difference in opinion with Joseph Anderson may be due to how I played the Scholar of the First Sin edition, which added more enemies to some of the areas, but I also think it's because Joseph Anderson didn't consider dying to extremely well-hidden gank squads unfair like I personally do. The area of Dark Souls 1 that feels the most like Dark Souls 2 is the Tomb of the Giants, a terrible gank fest where you can't see anything, and this is also one of Joseph Anderson's favorite late-game areas in the first game. If he likes this area despite having to memorize where every unfair gank squad is in the darkness by dying through trial and error, then it makes sense why he wouldn't consider Dark Souls 2 enemy placement to be all that bad, since he doesn't consider dying to ambushes or hidden archers as a cheap death. Of course, this might be a bad example because the late-game Dark Souls 2 ganks are much worse than late-game Dark Souls 1. This might not appear true on a first playthrough, but with the exception of New Londo, every single terrible endgame Dark Souls 1 level isn't difficult if you know what you're doing. Sure, Lost Izalith is unfinished, the Duke's Archives might be annoying sometimes, but I can pretty easily rush through the content I don't like. Even at level 1, I only died once or twice on the Nito boss run because I just memorized where to go in the darkness. This is not true for Dark Souls 2's endgame. You can know exactly how to get through Iron Keep and still have a migraine if you don't methodically pick off every ranged enemy with a bow. The frustrations of Dark Souls 2's endgame is forced on the player whether you like it or not, whereas the unfinished levels in Dark Souls 1 are easy to rush through so fast it almost feels like you skipped it. The best example of this is Ceaseless Discharge, a terrible and unfinished and unfair boss, and they let you just cheese it. If this was Dark Souls 2, they'd put a few enemies on the boss run to make it harder, but since it's Dark Souls 1, you can just skip the boss with the cheese strat. While I may bash Dark Souls 2 endgame levels for being terrible, they aren't that bad if you pull out all of the stops. Or at least I'd like to say this, but it's too boring for me to find out. When I say pull out all the stops, I mean use OP melee weapons, life gems, magic, bows, great shields, or power stancing, and probably summons to top it all off. This sounds pretty boring to me. An RPG nightmare of doing a bunch of mundane things to assemble the best stat-based build and upgrade all of your stuff and get all the spells to become so overpowered that you can counter the overtuned level design. But for those gamers who want to play Elder Scrolls Battlespire or Kingsfield, that is extremely hard while having an action game dodge roll button, then Dark Souls 2 might be their favorite game in the series. I'll restate it once more. I like RPGs with a good story, and I like action games with or without a good story, leaving Dark Souls 2 at a weird middle ground for me. It's not a good action game, actually it's downright awful, but if you focus on the RPG elements and add a little bit of dodge roll skill here or there, then it's not that bad. But having to deal with finding the best stats and gear is boring if the rewards is just more gank squads and the ability to grind out more stats and gear. I don't want to grind for gear, I want to grind my personal skill at the game. While we are on the topic of cheap deaths due to gank squads, this also has an important psychological effect on how the player clears a Souls game. Let's compare No Man's Wharf to Dark Souls 3 Cathedral of the Deep level. On a weak melee build with limited options, you must be on the lookout for gank squads in the Cathedral. There is a lot of loot everywhere, but there are also thralls hidden about the level. This puts a player in a unique mindset where they are constantly surveying the area for traps and ambushes while being rewarded for spotting enemies ahead of time. Now let's look at No Man's Wharf. Where are the enemies coming from? Could I even go through it slowly on a melee build? And there are so many enemies that the ganks occur every 2 seconds, making the game feel like there are respawning enemies off screen that you would see in Devil May Cry 3, a mechanic perfectly suited for that game, but this is not suitable for a slow, janky Dark Souls title. Cathedral of the Deep has a perfect amount of ganks that are all preventable with careful observation, while No Man's Wharf is just enemy spam that makes a player run past it or use every overpowered tool at their disposal to overcome the challenge with hit trading in an RPG-based way. I will always enjoy the mindset Dark Souls 1 and 3 put the player in that rewards careful observation over Dark Souls 2 enemy spam, but I should also state that hit trading did improve my overall enjoyment of the first 2/3 of Dark Souls 2 by a lot, as well as most of the DLC that is in the boss run. Despite this, I still want to emphasize that I in no way regret making my hate-filled critique about Dark Souls 2. From a mechanical action combat perspective, Dark Souls 2 is an absolute failure of a game in every sense of the word, and all of my criticism should ring true for anyone who played on a weak melee-only build like I did. This discussion on how my build negatively impacted my play experience really got me thinking about why public perception of Dark Souls 2 changed in recent years. It's one one of those games that will always have a dedicated following no matter how many evil people like me hate on it, and in turn it will always have a group of haters despite fans of the game saying it's their favorite in the series. So what's going on here? When the game first arrived, the average opinion of the game was positive, yet slowly over time more and more people came over with me to the dark side of Dark Souls 2 haters. H-Bomber Guy said that the reviewers initially gave Dark Souls 2 good scores, and then Dark Souls vets played the game wrong because they were locked on all the time, and they started to spread hate that was unfair to the game, changing the widely accepted opinion of Dark Souls 2 to be that it's a bad Souls game. I'm going to present a different theory for the discrepancy between the reviewer and the game. The average Souls fan's opinion of Dark Souls 2 got more negative over time, not because they woke up and realized it was a bad game. In reality, we started disliking Dark Souls 2 over time because we all got too good at Dark Souls. Dark Souls 2 is such a weird game to look at in retrospect, as Bloodborne Dark Souls 3 would later teach so many players how to beat the game with the weak build by learning the boss's dodge roll patterns. And we found out that it's a lot of fun. Many Souls vets were formed playing Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne because they captured that hard but fair difficulty even with the weak melee build, and that's amazing. Unfortunately, dodging doesn't work half of the time in Dark Souls 2 anyways, so you can't really play it with the mindset that it's a fun skill-based action game, because it's not. It's a terrible action game. But back in the day, Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 had tons of build variety that was really good and viable. From high poise to magic to the Black Knight halberd itself, it wasn't too hard to make Dark Souls 1 much easier. Yet even these older Souls games with the jankier hitboxes were still a lot of fun on a weak melee build, and none of the challenges ever seemed too unfair. The Dark Souls 1 players who loved the overpowered strength and poise builds had a game built for them in Dark Souls 2. This new title dared to challenge your playstyle in a meaningful way with even cooler power stancing attacks to help you overcome the difficulty. It was a fun time for these players, but then as new fast-paced Souls games were being released that were built around weaker melee builds that fully interact with all of the boss's mechanics, the average player started treating the series as action games rather than RPGs, and then those Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne players went back to Dark Souls 2 only to find out that it is one of the worst, most punishing action games of all time. Dark Souls 2 didn't get worse, it's just that we got too good. We're good enough to drop the shield and only roll to evade attacks, we're good enough to never hit trade, and we're too good for Dark Souls 2 to be much fun because it's not really meant for this playstyle. It's an RPG first that isn't afraid to throw giant gank fests at the player that require weak builds to kite for hours to have a chance at victory. Or you can just get a great sword and hit trade, or get magic, or get anything that's overpowered, and then overcome the difficulty in an RPG way. But what if there was a special area that was so hard that hit trading alone didn't work? Well, there's actually tons of areas like that. Iron Keep comes to mind. But what if there was one area that rose above the others? An area so terrible it defies all common logic. A cancer on the Dark Souls series that was so frighteningly malicious in its design that it almost requires a hit-trading mage archer with the best weapons in the game and summons to overcome without wanting to literally die? You guys want me, Feeble King, to overcome an overtuned piece of content that isn't fun at all on a weak build and is created to challenge people who play with the most overpowered builds? Now, am I talking about the Frigid Outskirts or Melania? The point of the Frigid Outskirts and Melania isn't to be a fun experience or fight. It's to be so dang hard that every Souls player, no matter how overpowered, will die many times and get so hard stuck that they can't help but talk to their friends about it. Almost like free marketing. Wow, Melania is so hard and brutal, no one can beat her, and then someone like me or Let Me Solo Her does it at level 1 or consistently at a higher level, or you suffer enough in the Frigid Outskirts to not use summons or even do that at level 1, although I won't. But the point is that these hard challenges create heroes. Players gawk in awe of how good Let Me Solo Her is, but is it worth it? It's not a good fight. Melania is trash and unfair. I had mechanically mastered the fight after about 5 hours at level 1, but then it took another 5 hours just because of dumb waterfowl dance RNG. This isn't good design even if it creates legendary stories, but I guess that's the trade-off. And that is precisely the the point of the Frigid Outskirts, to create stories and drama because of how terribly designed it is, not because you want to have any fun. And oh boy, did the Frigid Outskirts create a story of pain, suffering, and boredom for me. What do I even say about this level? It's bad. The worst. Completely awful in every way. But really, it's just the complete realization of the Dark Souls 2 design philosophy. Make the game so unfun and unfair that players are pushed into overpowered builds and summons, except here hit trading isn't enough to make the game fun. You need summons, or you suffered a shit design. They literally took Sanctuary Guardian, made him harder with less HP, and then spammed Sanctuary Guardian with a deer coat of paint all across the level. The only positive to this area is that it contains one of the most mechanically engaging fights in Dark Souls 1 that you don't auto-win by circle strafing, but that's only because they copy and pasted a better Dark Souls 1 DLC boss. The same flying attack, the same lightning attack, similar charge attacks, really the same except they're missing a few combos and better hitboxes from the Sanctuary Guardian. One would assume that building in the distance would lead to a boss, but no, it's just a Ferris Lockstone that does nothing. Are these developers making a fun game, or just a bunch of trolls figuring out the best way to manipulate the player into being as pissed off as possible? The Frigid Outskirts is a lazy, boring rehash that requires one of the hardest dodge rolls in the game to avoid their charge attacks while you can't see crap. It's lazy and terrible, and the fact that this is a boss run displays how little the B team took from their negative feedback. Is this any fun at all in a mechanical level that you could interact with on a weak build? No, of course not. Have you not been paying attention? Almost all of Dark Souls 2 is terrible when played as an action game first, and this is just the full realization of that. While almost everyone hates the Frigid Outskirts, myself included, I should note that from another perspective, it's actually the greatest area in the game. Imagine the most unfair hidden boss or dungeon in a Final Fantasy or a Kingsfield game that requires using every overpowered tool at your disposal to overcome the challenge through stats. And then you put that extremely hard or unfair level at the end of your RPG game as a hidden challenge. But do you want to know what I do when I reach that one hidden boss in a turn-based RPG or hit trading game that is impossible unless I grind my stats or look up the best builds in the game? I quit. I don't care. I quit. If I was able to beat Midir and Freedy and Gale and Manus multiple times at level 1, I'm certain I can memorize the deer charge dodge rules better, find ways of perceiving depth when the deer reaches you better, and the most optimal path to the boss, and then kite them in another dumb 1v2 fight. I'm sure I can. I just don't care anymore. I play RPGs for the story, not the dumb grind fests. I love Dark Souls because when I grind, I'm not grinding up my numbers. Hell, I'm usually level 1 when I play these games now. I'm grinding skill. And Dark Souls 2 is not fun when you grind to get better at Dark Souls 2. Some people memorize all the cheap deaths and do no-hit runs of the Frigid Outskirts as well as the entire game. I'm aware it's possible, but the game wasn't thoughtfully designed around being hard but fair as an action game, so I quit. Of course, maybe that's my biggest problem. As a kid playing Skyrim, I would get stuck on a hard dungeon and I wouldn't ever give up. I wouldn't leave the dungeon, and I wouldn't look up stronger weapons or how to use the level and skill tree system because it didn't matter. Who cares about menus? I'm gonna outskill it. I stopped playing Skyrim after about 20 hours when I was 11 and the game had just come out. I couldn't figure out why people loved it so much since the hit trading combat was so boring and there wasn't a way to overcome challenge in combat through getting good, just by bringing better stats to counter the unfair challenge. And so I gave up on my dumb ways of playing RPGs without leveling up as I did in Diablo 2 and Skyrim, only to give up and go hollow in both games. But then everything changed in high school and I played Dark Souls 1 for the first time. I was stuck at the bottom of Blighttown, underleveled and undergeared, still using the shield to block Quilag's fire sword attacks and dying every time. So I switched up my combat mechanics, I learned her animation tells, and I overcame the adversity by getting better at the game. That was the moment I fell in love with Dark Souls. That feeling of being outmatched only to overcome adversity by grinding until you, the player, not the character, were good enough to surpass any challenge. That is what Dark Souls is all about to me. If this is why I love Dark Souls 1 and 3, my mindset is why I hate Dark Souls 2. I would never think this game is in the same orbit of quality as the other titles, but it tempts me with the idea of overcoming challenge with skilled play, only to bring me pain at every turn. But I'm a glutton for punishment, and if I know a challenge isn't completely impossible, I will try to overcome the challenge no matter what the cost. And maybe that's my biggest problem with Dark Souls 2. If there are mechanics to master, no matter how terrible they are, I will master them, and I will win. And so it was that I suffered through the spam of Sanctuary Guardians, I mean reindeer, and fought on through the unfun BS without summons because it's just who I am. I started playing with these great swords, and I won't change my playstyle by adding magic or using pine resins ever until the deed is done. Hell, I had to look up if pine resin exists in Dark Souls 2 because I'm so averse to using anything other than my weapon and the dodge roll button that I wouldn't know if pine resin was even in the game. If it's technically possible to win without thinking about boring things like stats, then I will do it. And so I killed the Sanctuary Guardians one at a time since running past was not an option. I blasted loud Eminem music to keep me focused while I killed the reindeer over and over and over and over and over and over again until they stopped spawning, and after an hour of suffering, I beat the boss third try in classic Dark Souls 2 fashion, and the boss is just another reskin. I don't know if I can brag about beating bosses easily when I'm using overpowered weapons, but I almost won second try and then got them after. It's really weird that the mechanics of the base reindeer enemies are harder and more mechanically engaging than the boss itself. Honestly, if there was no pressure of the boss run being terrible, the boss would have almost been brain dead easy, and very boring, almost like all of Dark Souls 2 non-DLC bosses, and so my adrenaline was fake. I wasn't experiencing extreme anxiety at the excitement because the boss is that good, more because the boss run is so unbearably awful that failure means a lot of boredom and frustration. I don't like this, but I guess people who like Dark Souls 2 don't mind the feeling. Either way, the boss fight is a mechanical disappointment. I think the reason I was so upset about Sir alone is because he's an amazing fight, and despite how great he is, I still hated my experience of fighting him because he was too hard for such a terrible, punishing boss run. The two dogs aren't really like this. The developers wanted the only challenge to be a terrible boss run with a mediocre reskin 1v2 fight slapped on at the end just to kill the player a few times so that they complain to their friends about how hard Dark Souls 2 is. But is it really hard, or is it just frustrating and time-consuming? Dying a lot to a boss at level 1 is also time-consuming, but I'm always improving my skill as a person, so I'm always enjoying the learning experience. A hard boss run lengthens how long it takes to beat the boss, but it's not actually hard. It just takes so long to clear in a slow way that you get bored and rush it and die. Almost like when an Elden Ring boss spams never-ending combos for you to just get bored, attack, and die. In conclusion, the Frigid Outskirts isn't a bad Dark Souls 2 area, it is the epitome of Dark Souls 2 design. This is a hidden level in an RPG meant to drain you of all of your heals and buffs you've saved through your entire journey, and you're supposed to use the strongest, most legendary boss weapons to overcome the adversity with maybe a pinch of skill. Since the level also does suck, it takes so damn long to get to the boss even when you kill the reindeer enough to despawn, but whether this is the epitome of unfair Dark Souls 2 level design that requires the player to stat up with summons or just a terrible area, it doesn't really matter. I only beat this zone because the comment section asked me to, and it was one of the worst gaming experiences of my entire life. I will never do this again, ever. You're welcome. The weird thing about reviewing any Souls game is that many of my viewers will completely disagree with me and get angry over my opinions, despite not playing the same game as me. If you use summons or magic or weapons strong enough to hit trade, then your experience to a person who played with the weak build is so radically different that you actually don't have much in common. The two playthroughs are not really comparable. In fact, a weak normal leveled melee build is more similar to a level 1 run than someone who used a high DPS weapon that has the ability to hit trade. It does start to bug me when people insult my video only to turn around and say that they use magic or power stancing or what have you, but in the case of Dark Souls 2 fans, I really do understand their frustration. I stated that Dark Souls 2 was irredeemably bad despite not having explored any builds other than the one I assumed would be the most fun, and that was wrong of me. Speaking of being wrong, I said something very wrong in my critique of Dark Souls 2 that I now want to correct. I said that Dark Souls 2 is a bad game. Initially, I was rejecting the sentiment held by many who say that Dark Souls 2 isn't a bad game, just a bad Souls game. In my previous critique, I corrected this statement to say that Dark Souls 2 is just a bad game. However, now it's time to pull a double correction and say that Dark Souls 2 is actually a bad action game, and many people see the Souls series as action games, thus making Dark Souls 2 a bad Souls game from that perspective. But for people who want a stat-based RPG that requires a bunch of action dodge roll skill, minimal story, extreme punishment for death, and bosses that serve as fun little mini challenges to wrap up the extremely hard levels rather than to be the main attraction, then you may like Dark Souls 2. I will never like Dark Souls 2, and that's okay because it wasn't built for me. It was made for those who love Kingsfield and Dark Souls, and they wanted a game that contained elements of both to be combined into one. If this game was called Kingsfield 5 with a dodge roll, then I wouldn't have bought it, and I wouldn't have hated it. I don't hate Kingsfield or Elder Scrolls Combat because I understand that it's made for a completely different type of person. As it turns out, the real first sin wasn't Gwyn linking the fire, it was FromSoft lying to millions of people by selling a game called Dark Souls 2 when it should have been titled Kingsfield 5. And honestly, after this whole crazy journey of playing Dark Souls 2, a game that I dislike, for over 130 hours and beating the game 3 times, once at level 1, and making 2 whole hour-long video YouTube essays discussing the game, all I feel is that I was robbed and lied to. FromSoft told me that this was a Dark Souls game, implying that it would be a fun action game like Dark Souls 1 and 3, and this lie, the real first sin, led to over 100 hours of pure pain and misery for me. And all of these awful experiences were the result of a simple lie that this was Dark Souls when it was far from it. If I played Dark Souls 2 for the first time with co-op summons and magic and hit trading and the whole kitchen sink, would my negative opinion have changed? The honest answer is no, because I wouldn't have ever bought this game in the first place if I knew I was going to do a bunch of boring RPG stat things to match the extreme challenge with no reward of fun action combat or a good story. And so I conclude this defense of Dark Souls 2 by saying the game was rigged from the start. I was never capable of loving or even liking this game because it wasn't made for me. But it isn't a bad game, just a bad Souls title and a terrible action game. Welcome to what was originally the entire video. I was just upset with the dumb argument in the comment section, wanted to express why it was dumb, but then I thought if I were to explore a bad argument in defense of Dark Souls 2, then I should also explore a good argument, and then I almost beat the game again in New Game Plus and beat the Frigid Outskirts with no summons because I need to suffer for good YouTube content. A simple idea for a quick video ended up quickly evolving into the hardest essay that I've written yet, and I'm just happy to close the book on this game for good. It's so interesting how when I first played Dark Souls 2 6 or 7 years ago, I couldn't put into words why I hated it. I just hated it. I guess this goes to show how much I've evolved as a critic, and I couldn't have done it without you, the commenters. Well, actually, a lot of the Dark Souls 2 fan base was awful, mean, and toxic, but the nice comments that were logical, saying I should have played the game like an RPG, got through to me and caused me to see the game in a new light. Although I may have trashed on H-Bomber Guy's Dark Souls 2 video a lot, I should also state that I liked the majority of his videos and agreed with his point that locked off combat is good for gank fights in Dark Souls 2. It's just that every time he tries to explain why Dark Souls 1 is worse than Dark Souls 2 because backtracking, I lose brain cells. Anyways, let's get to the main argument for why my hate-filled critique about Dark Souls 2 is an illogical hit piece against the game for views. It's really weird how fixated people were with the whole running past enemies in the early game areas. People were so fixated on the gameplay and my tone of voice that they ignored all of my actual words, which is the important part. The reason why this is weird is because after clearing the game with hit trading, I realized that the terrible enemy spam gank squads are the norm for this game, not the exception. Even if I did deceive the audience by intentionally triggering enemy aggro to do a multi-fight, which I actually didn't, we can't forget that this is also the same game where No Man's Wharf and Iron Keep and Shrine of Amana and the Catacombs and the numerous gank squads in the DLC still exist. Even many areas of the early game, like the forest area or No Man's Wharf, are also terrible with gank squads, whether you're trying to trigger enemy aggro or not. Even these terrible early game areas pale in comparison to the late game areas that are really bad with gank squads. So I don't know why people cared so much that I triggered a few too many enemies in the Forest of the Fallen Giants, since that's one of the better gank squads anyways, because it's not that bad. Although I don't think showing some of the worst gank squads in the early game really matters, since the early game isn't at all what I take issue with, I will admit to some wrongdoing here. I should have displayed a more balanced amount of early game areas and gank squads, of which there are many, but I kind of stuck to just showing a few of the worst ones. I also shouldn't have used the hyperbole when I said that Dark Souls 2 had 5 times the amount of enemies as Dark Souls 1 while showing the worst early game gank squads, since this did misrepresent the game experience for new players, and I do apologize. In reality, Dark Souls 2 is about 2 to 2.5 times the amount of enemies per level, maybe sometimes 3, when comparing the average number of enemies in each level between Dark Souls 1 and 2, although some places in Dark Souls 2, like No Man's War for Iron Keep, do push the multiplier to be more around 3 or even 3.5 times the amount of enemies as a Dark Souls 1 area. I thought it would be obvious I was exaggerating, but to a new player who sees footage of me fighting 30 hollows at once, they might think that this is the average play experience, which was wrong of me. The real reason for my error was a result of me being too lazy to scour my video footage to find a bunch of different encounters, so I just kept showing the same gankfest in the Forest of the Fallen Giants to save on time. But if you want another one, here's one. Or how about this one giant gankfest in the Forest of the Fallen Giants? If you think Dark Souls 2 isn't full of ganks as bad or worse than what I showed, then you're in denial of what Dark Souls 2 is. It's a game that spams enemies at the player and expects you to wipe them out on an overpowered build, as all of its million gankfests point to this. I should restate that showing a bad early game gank barely matters because it pales in comparison to late game gank squads, but since it pissed so many Dark Souls 2 experts off, let's discuss how I manipulated the game footage to show only the absolute worst early game gank squads, and just to make it more interesting, let's make it a game. For every gank squad that was the game's fault, I get a point, and if I deliberately triggered enemy aggro to display an unfair enemy multi-fight, then Dark Souls 2 experts get a point. Let's start by breaking down the issue of running past enemies into two different sections. The first being running past enemies in a level, and the second being running past enemies in a boss run. When looking at running past enemies in the level, so many people said that I staged the worst gank squads to prove my biased point, so let's see who the real culprit of staging a gank squad really was. In the Forest of the Fallen Giants, I kill every enemy on the ground, run up here, and then drop down only to die to ridiculous fall damage. So in order to retrieve my souls quickly, I run to the ladder, only to find a hollow whose AI is programmed to go down the ladder and kick me off the second I try to go up it, and he will not go down unless I go up it, forcing me to fight the 10 or so ground hollows I ran past. This is a clear example of Dark Souls 2 tricking me into a multi-fight. Some people in the comments were saying that I staged this encounter, when in reality the true culprit of staging a gank squad was, drumroll please, Dark Souls 2. The fact that not a single Dark Souls 2 expert remembered how this ladder hollow forces you into the fight completely baffles me, as they're the people who replay this game time and time again. Why am I telling them how the game works if they are the experts? I guess that's 1 point for me. You could say that I should have just killed all of the hollows when trying to retrieve my souls up at the top of the ladder, but then I could also say that they don't need to program a hollow specifically to stop you from going up the ladder to force you into a multi-fight. They just want you to do a multi-fight. It wasn't me. I don't know what to say. A somewhat comically huge encounter with really slow enemies that is very doable and I never actually died to. Attacking this footage should not have been the focus of Dark Souls 2's fans' wrath, because I didn't hate it. I even said in the video that I liked it. That's why it's in the good section of the video. If you really want to counter my argument, then you need to look at my issues with the late game areas. In the early game, another bad gank squad was when I ran past the enemies in the Lost Bastille boss run on the way to Ruin Sentinels. There is a trash item by the ladder that I picked up, and the pickup animation is so slow like every other action in Dark Souls 2 that I couldn't get to the ladder in time without being hit by enemies, again forcing me into a 1v50 gank fight. I didn't stage or want this encounter to happen, the game tricked me into it with loot. You could consider this to be my fault more than the other encounter because I picked up the loot without clearing all of the enemies, but this trash item was put there specifically to trick players who run past enemies on a boss run into a cheap death, and probably over 90% of players run past enemies on a boss run if they can, so let's not kid ourselves and say the game didn't stage this gank. I'm still taking the point here because it really looked like I had time to get the loot, but Dark Souls 2 had to be so f***ing slow, and that's it. That's why my video is the most terrible critique of Dark Souls 2 ever created. That's it. Literally 2 clips of early game gank fights was all it took to invalidate the whole video to Dark Souls 2 fans. You could say that this isn't true because I ran past enemies throughout the whole game, even in the end game, and I shouldn't have. But how the hell else would anybody beat this game with the freaking broadsword and no magic and no summons and no arrows if they didn't run past the enemies in the end game? It would take like 20 minutes per smelter demon attempt. It's just not reasonable to expect that from the build I used in the video. The game is bad when used with the broadsword. It's not my fault. The game's just not good. A reasonable counter argument would be that I should stop using a broadsword and play the game like it's an RPG, and that's an amazing, intelligent argument that I covered in great detail in part 1 of this video, but telling me to just not run past the enemies and fight them all with my broadsword is a terrible argument, and it doesn't make any sense because the game sucks when played this way. And these 2 early game clips of gank squans was the reason why 90% of Dark Souls 2 fans were angry in the comments. 2 minor issues in the beginning of the video caused Dark Souls 2 fans to ignore all of the valid criticisms in the ugly part of my essay for weak builds. They clung onto a few issues to revoke all of my credibility as a game critic because this video was not completely perfect and had a couple minor flaws, which is ironic because they are the same people who love Dark Souls 2, a game riddled with flaws.